I've been in a lot of different settings, and I find that the age we're in is stunning in terms of what happens and all of the things that seem to be in the air, up in the air. So I, naturally I'm doing thinking about this, but as a person by the name of Phyllis Tribble, I believe it was, wrote, she said, the observation has been made that about every 500 years in the life of the church, there have been major transformations that came out of lots of chaos. And at the time, you didn't know what was going to be retained and what wouldn't. It wasn't as though everything got thrown out, but then there ended up being new. The Reformation, of course, was 500 years ago. And we seem to be in one of those situations right now where so many things have changed, the philosophy, etc. So I've been doing some thinking about that, but I don't have answers. It's more just to see it. So I would just be curious to know if there were some things. I will start out just saying a little bit about myself, but I wanted to know if you had some thoughts that you would find helpful. Because what I've done is I've served my first 2 years as a chaplain in the CPE, and then I went into the parish and realized I'd never go back. I mean, the parish was what I wanted to do. And I served in a small congregation, then I was an associate in a large congregation in Sioux Falls, and then I was ended up being the lead pastor at First Lutheran in Duluth, 1 year with Michael Rognus, but then he moved to the seminary. And then after much soul searching, I ended up having a kind of a call experience to say I needed to be open for a job that I was highly ambivalent about, and that was to be a bishop. And then I'm glad, but it was then I went to another large congregation and found out what it's like when you're in the middle of a recession and you have a $12 million debt. I got a heart attack and decided that going back was not going to be helpful because there was going to be a lot of work. So I went into some interims and have done one in Marshall, Minnesota, Bethel in Madison, St. John's in Jamestown, Trinity in Owatonna, back to First Lutheran in Sioux Falls, Bethlehem in St. Cloud, and here, my third time out of retirement. Each time my wife has said, "Peter, I think you should take it." I've been trying to interpret that. There are obviously a lot deeper reasons than that. I feel like actually I had a couple of years at Bethlehem in South Minneapolis because my dad, who was becoming very old, he died at 100. We would go to a Bible study that Phil's dad led, and he always talked about how much he appreciated that group, and so I would go pretty much every Sunday for 2 years, and so I felt like that was my church. So I've kind of moved around quite a bit and had quite a few perspectives. So anyway, just a little bit about my family. I'm the oldest of 5 boys. My father was the third boy of 4. And then the first 2 children we had were boys. So it was quite an adjustment for me to be married, and a bigger adjustment for my wife, because simple things like you hang a towel up, you don't just throw it in a glob. Those were things that my dear mother, I think she gave up after the third boy, because the story that she tells is that this was back when they would often put you a little bit out. They didn't have the father in there, and everybody knew she'd had 4 sons. and then the baby was born, and I don't think they thought that she was conscious, but she remembers hearing the nurse say, "Oh, a boy." And then the doctor said, "What's the matter with a healthy boy?" So that same nurse came in with little David into her room. "Look at you got a boy." And she said, "I heard that conversation." But by that time, I think she realized that she really did well with boys, and she eventually, when she substitute taught, they started at Richfield, she would sometimes be put in classes where there may be some problem boys, and she would always say that they were easier to deal with than problem girls. And I don't know if you agree with that, but I think perhaps all of the experience of my mom. At any rate, that's what I come out of, and then 3 of my brothers were pastors, and both of my grandparents, and about 4 of my uncles. So I just grew up in that environment, but not with the idea that that was any more special than any other vocation. So I actually ended up going to seminary as an experiment, whereas my father had had a very vivid call experience where he shifted in one day between being a musician, which he always loved, to going into the ministry, and then a circuitous route. So I did not grow up as the parish kid. I grew up with my father trying to explain it. He founded Search Institute, if some of you know that. He happened to do his graduate work when, just before the big merger, when there were 8 Lutheran churches and the youth directors would get together. And he was wondering about what he should do for his thesis. And the idea came up, wouldn't it be great if we understood what young people really are concerned about, because you got all these stereotypes out there. So they said, we will make sure that if you do a survey, our churches will take it. And so they got 95% return on a 400-item research project. And this was when there were about 5 computers in Minneapolis, but one of them was Lutheran Brotherhood. And the president just said, say, I heard there's somebody doing research, give them some extra hours. So this was when you had cards and everything. But anyway, it was the first research project of a large group ever done with young people. So that kind of just moved him in that area. So that ended up becoming also part of my life. I'm married, and Norma and I have been married for 51 years. We have 3 kids. I have a son in Japan, another son that just moved from New York to Dallas, but he's got the New York job. He can do it from, his wife is from Dallas. And then a daughter that lives in Egan, and we have 6 grandchildren. And to my delight, I'm now able to relate on a regular basis to my grandkids. The other ones were in New York. But 5 and 4-year-old boy that are very much part of our lives. And that is just a wonder. So I am a real typical grandfather. And I now understand the people that were grandparents, and I would always notice how quickly they'd pull out the pictures and this look in their eyes of just love. And the minute it happened to me, it was, yeah, I'm in. Any other? So that's been my life, and very glad to be here at Zumbro. It turned out that I got a phone call from Barb Street. Barb Street I supervised when she was an intern in Owatonna, and she now works for the Synod. And there are 2 people from the Owatonna church there, and they said, well, why don't you call Peter? And I had just retired, I'd been retired for 3 months, and I got this call out of the blue, and I thought, my goodness, but there are good reasons for that. But shall we go out? Shall we move on? how would it be if maybe we wondered a little bit together on what's happening in our culture and in our world, and the impact that this is having on the church, and this whole question of how does the church, how do we in the United States be the church in terms of what is most needed in these times when things have changed so remarkably. When I was at Bethlehem in St. Cloud, the person that I was a colleague with told me about a joke that is apparently shared by a number of his colleagues. He was 40, and he said, I have never known a time when the church was prospering like people talk about it. So the gallows humor was, what are you going to do in 10 years? And I thought, I've never heard that joke. When I graduated in 1973, we just assumed the church was there. Sometimes we weren't even paying probably good attention for it was there, and sometimes in our generation we're hitting up against it and that sort of a thing because it's there. Remember Sunday mornings? Remember being Sundays as a kid, how boring it was? You had 4 channels, nothing on, nothing going on, and now, if you're in athletics, you're probably, and you're serious about it, you're on a traveling team, and that's prime time for your tournaments. And so you've got this enormous change in terms of work, etc., etc. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. A secular society in which increasingly the percentage of people that are believing that there is anything beyond the closed continuum of our universe, saying with some pride that they are atheists and that it's superstitious to believe in God. And then at the same time amongst millennials, as I'm hearing it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, for many millennials, I just remember a conversation in Bethlehem with one of them was saying, I don't usually like to say I'm a Christian because then I have to defend why I am. The idea being that in our society of media where you end up getting certain presentation of Christianity, which is, the best stories are the dark side. There's this sense of Christians as not being authentic. And we're in a hyper-individualistic world where authenticity and finding your own way is very important. So for some people, even remember we grew up, I don't go to church, but I should. Now we grow up where a whole generation is saying, why would you go to church? And so we know, we see all of these things. We have this vast competition for our time. My friend, Owen Christensen, said, I walk across the Luther campus. He was a college student there, and he lives in Decorah. I walk across and he said, now, how many, I bet you're going to say, I've been here too. I walk across, and it's break. It's a beautiful spring day. All kinds of students are outside. Only one looked up when I walked by. I'm looking for everybody else, they weren't even talking. Everybody else. And yet it's generationally, if you've been reading some of the larger studies, and some of you would know a lot more about this than I guess, it's registering to be the loneliest generation. So the question ends up being, you're connected, but a lot less face-to-face. I remember the director of choir program in Duluth said that they traveled Europe every year, and he said, we never had in the past to teach our choir members how to get along with each other when they roomed together. We had to start doing it in 1989. The reason was because most of the kids had their own bedroom. Whereas when the other generation, you shared it. You know, more kids. And I'm thinking, that's 30 years ago. And then you start extrapolating that. And then you say, what are the 5 key elements to the church as a community that you see all the way back from the early church? Worship. Teaching. Koinonia. For those of you who aren't familiar with what that word means, it's the experience of deep fellowship mediated by Christ that creates a deep community. If you've been such a thing as a small group, it's the church within the church. If you're in a large church, you can't experience relational intimacy with a big church, but the idea being is we have close friends. If I was sick, they'd know about it. If somebody died, we'd have people bringing over food. That deep sense of interpersonal connection. My guess is that if you're down here, probably you're all pretty connected to the church. Do you have such a group? Yeah, you do. You do. And what's interesting is in one of the world surveys of the church, the one that was probably most associated with a deep sense of faith were people that had a small group. Because sometimes some of the most profound changes in us are when we work through life in the context of deep friends. That's koinonia. And now, if you're competing even for people's time, how do you establish that in the church? So you know, it's saying like this is at the core. I mean, this is at the core. So anyway, and then the other one, of course, is you're sharing the gospel, the hope of Jesus. You have in your mission statement. The other one is your vocation, deeds of love and kindness. Those 5 have always characterized the church. They are kind of at the core. And so that's one of the questions is how are we able to create this church of the future when we are dealing with the fact that just doing it well doesn't necessarily translate into all kinds of people coming to your church like it was in 1999. Remember that? And there was just a lot of optimism. And everybody has said around 2003 or 4, people started saying, we're noticing a decline in worship attendance. 2013 was the magic year in St. Cloud, where they said all of a sudden, all churches, Catholic, etc., said, where's our church attendance gone? You don't know for stuff like that. So anyway, one of the questions I've been asking is, okay, God's with us. We're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's really important not to do. But just how do you frame things and work in such a way that you're establishing significant footholds in future generations? Have any of you been thinking about this? One grandmother my age at St. Cloud, a former educator, said, and there was emotion in her voice. I want there to be a church for my grandkids. And I feel the same. So what ends up being important for us?
Are these grandkids going to want to be?
Are the grandkids, well, there'll always be some. The question was, are the grandkids going to want to be in church? I think here's why I believe that what we have it is so important in our society, because I think we're seeing what happens when you don't hold some of these things to be sacred. Witness what's happened with Facebook. It's like greed on steroids, but it's with a new tool that nobody's ever had at that level in the history of the world. We all want to influence people, and advertisers all have wanted to help do that. I still remember a good friend and a mentor, Raleigh Martinson, saying when he was in touch with some people, he said, the smartest psychologist that I ever knew at the University of Minnesota took a job that paid him 3 times as much money to go to New York, and here's what his sole goal was. Here's his job. How do you get people to make decisions without realizing they're doing it? How do you influence people on a deep psychological level to move in directions? Now you have how many of you seen Social Dilemma? See it. Because you've got some people from Facebook and Google who are right at the heart of it that are saying, we won't even let our kids use Facebook. Because here's what's happening. There's a creation. You've got buildings much, much, much bigger than this, filled with computers that are analyzing the algorithms, all of the data that they're getting from our usage of Facebook, etc. So they find tendencies, and then they nudge you towards what they come to see you liking or are interested in. So if you are in the South, you will be nudged mostly to people that are saying that climate change is not real. If you're in the Midwest, there's much more about how it is real. One of the extreme examples I showed, remember Dr. J in basketball? He went down the rabbit hole. Now he's getting, and even talking about this publicly, he finally has changed his mind, but he moved to the point where he believed and was advocating that it was a conspiracy, that the world was round, it was really flat. We've never had the power to take crazy ideas and actually make them have traction, and a lot of times we don't even realize it's happening. So the contention of the Social Dilemma was, one of the reasons we have people that are so convinced that that all people on the left are being led by somebody that's in the grip of the devil, is that if that's your world, and this is what Barack Obama said, we no longer have a common narrative. Then I think about the church here. Why do I care about it? I've never read it in the same way, but when you read John, do you notice the reverence for truth? The truth shall make you free. And that in the scripture's worldview, the devil's the confuser, the deceiver. That there's a very clear line about what's priority. We just heard about it. Loving neighbor as self. Justice. Now we are struggling with what's even true. And one of the things that I thought was most important, I heard was, and I now realize it, the problem with pervasive lying isn't so much that it's a lie, it's now you no longer know what the truth is. So people will say, well, I don't know, where's your source? I don't know what the truth is. And once you've kind of created this, so anyway, I think, I'm wondering, and I'd be interested in knowing what you're saying, what you're thinking about this. I'm wondering about the church coming down the road is do we need to pay much more attention where our pastoral leadership and our core leaders in the church are very committed to a deep walk so that there's a depth that understands the difference between the false and the true and can stand for that and articulate it so that when people are searching it, they're coming across something that has the capacity to lead somebody through a spiritual journey. Yes?
The thought about that related to that is that the church these days is evangelical. And they are out there preaching and saying that this is the way it is. The ELCA is not out there doing that. So we are being hijacked by them. We're afraid we're going to offend somebody in our congregation by talking about what they're talking about.
Well, yeah, and the ELCA, I mean, let's face it, I think, churches have their different strengths. I've always thought, I've even had Assemblies of God saying to me, Peter said, Luther's got great theologian. You guys got the theology, and you guys got the music. But in terms of, I suppose because we all came out of a state church, and that's very deep in the roots, but the idea of being out of the box a bit and engaging is one. Yeah. Did everybody hear? Yeah. I mean that would appear to be one of the things. A guy, I think it's Michael Root. Is it Michael? He's writing about this a lot, and one of the things that he is saying is that because in our world of kind of hyper-individualism, where the idea is what is truth is what you discover, and you tend not to see the community as having much authority, then the key thing ends up being the spiritual journey. And one of the things he was saying is that pastors really, to lead people in a spiritual journey, we've got to take it. Sometimes pastors got into the professional mode and then started burning out because they weren't going deep into the real life situation of what it means to have faith. I think that's shifting now. But when I came out of seminary, nobody heard of somebody having a spiritual director. Now it's quite common. And I think that's probably good. I think the Catholics really got that. But it occurred to me, it's not just the pastors, but it's the elders of the church too. I was in one church where they didn't have coherent elders in faith, and it was my friend and I, Hal Weldon. This is where I had my heart attack. And the reason was, I think, because all three pastors in their history had to leave for sexual misconduct. So, you end up, you probably had a lot of people just leave. But we were struggling with this, the church just at sea, and all of this debt and secrets and dysfunction, and we looked at each other, and Hal said, he said, I don't think we have a group of seasoned elders. I'm not sure where we have that. And not just elders, but people that are deep wells. And they really get it. And they're working it, and they understand it, kind of the human struggle and all of that. And I said, I think you're right. I really miss them. I'd never been in a church without it. And I just came to understand the power of seasoned faith. And I just remembered a good friend of mine, Owen, worked for A-Stop for a bit. Do you remember A-Stop? Do you know what that is? That is is an organization that came out of the pastor losing his daughter for a time to manipulation and basically kidnapping to make her a sexual slave. If you started hearing some of the things, remember a few years ago you were saying Minnesota was one of the top feeding systems for Las Vegas prostitution. And then he was just talking about the need for parents to know this. Well, so he was in that because of a situation within his own congregation. He was advocating for it, but he said something really interesting. He said, I learned that the most effective communities for helping former prostitutes make it in their next life, in other words, they've come out of this and now they're trying to put pieces together so that they can make it, happen to be a Roman Catholic group of sisters that are enclosed and they're devoting most of their time to prayer. Now, does that surprise you? You know what the stereotype would be? They don't know what the world's about. But here's the thing, when you go deep spiritually, you'll end up fighting all the demons. It's not an unscathed faith. It's a struggle. And when you get that sense of God's work within human issues, you have the capacity then to reach across that bridge. And so I'm wondering if one of the things we need to pay attention to in the church is, yes, the church normally has to be a first half of life church in terms of what it teaches, because kids, you form the structures, you do the teaching, etc. But now that we've got a whole lot of people like me that are living a lot longer, I'm 74, and here, I may live quite a bit, I don't know. We've never had this before in human history, but their second half spirituality oftentimes is different, but most churches are not geared to providing it. I'm wondering if that's one of the things we have to pay attention to. Does that make any sense? I'm seeing a few heads nodding. One of the reasons I think that is because the second largest group that's dropping out of the church, besides millennials, are people where the kids go. And they stop attending. Or so-and-so, they used to be here all the time. My wife's got a lot of friends that say, I just stopped going to church. I don't need it. And I find myself thinking, gee, they've been going all their lives. Is there something that it's kind of like the spirituality has always been connected to what the kids are learning, which is really important, but what's it like when you're starting to deal with your own mortality? Or the fact that you've got all of this time, you're retired, what's your vocation? I mean, there's a deeper, so I wondered if that's one of the things that needs to be. What time is it? And maybe I need to stop. Oh, okay. I've thrown out a few. Yeah, please.
Human beings want to be loved and cared for. Our religion is love and caring. We need to practice that.
Yeah.
We need to be more relational. We need to have more communication. Let's get together and communicate and learn about each other. Let's learn. Let's be willing to be lifelong learners. I mean, just think of what it would do for racism, for sexism, for all sorts, if we, instead of using our mouth to talk, we used our heart to listen. Oh, and what if Zumbro could communicate with, say, other Christians, and we could be a larger family here in Rochester? I mean, what could we do?
Yeah.
I mean, that would not estrange us from saying, oh, they're not gonna come to church, oh, look at that.
No.
Because we're gonna be showing love and caring.
Yeah.
Could we not do that?
Well, you see, I mean, what I'm hearing in your in what you're saying here is you're really pushing for, the church has not always been so authentic in what it is, in what it has communicated, and that we have to remember that it's when we are who we are at our best that you end up having the connections that start to be made that include love. In fact, they're led by love, and that that and loving relationships. Incidentally, there was a world study. Now it's 20 years old, but they found that was one of 8 characteristics that was critical to any church that was growing. If you're an organism and you're the church, person has to sense there's a sense of love here, and if there isn't, you can be doing everything perfectly, and it's not computing. So,
and you know what? What if we had conversations with the youth? What if we had adults and youth together? And talking, and they could tell us what is most on their mind. We could tell them, you know, there's wisdom, there's learning, there's whatever from both sides.
Well, and I don't mean to suggest there are many young people that are part of our church,
right?
And actually, adult youth connections have been shown to be really important. No question. And what you're describing is small groups are really important, because then we're having a chance. One of the reasons I was illustrating the problem where our society is becoming less face-to-face is that gets right at the heart of who we are as a church. We can't give in on that one. We have to find ways, because that's the power. Christ working in us, and the power of community. I mean, that's life-changing. Yeah. And that comes out of a sense of love.
Well, and honoring the elderly. I mean, think about that, too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, the intergeneration. And there have certainly been some movements. Thank you. Yes?
Speaking of small groups, if anyone here is not in a small group and might be interested, just speak to Pastor Jason. There are all kinds of small groups that are ongoing now, and they're very, very good.
Yep. Small groups are the church within the church, and they're very, very critical. Both. I'm in a couple right now, and I just can't tell you how I'm lifted. When you get to that point where you're able to just be who you are, wow, it's powerful. Other thoughts. I don't mean to make this problem solving. I think I did prepare. I don't know if I'll pass out the sheets and you can see. There are actually 8 things that have been found that interrelate like a plant organism. And they're marks of the church. And one is loving relationship. One is inspiring worship. One is holistic small groups. One is gift-oriented ministry. In other words, you can say, I believe God is using my gifts to serve. I believe I'm serving God through my gifts. That is the most highly connected to a person who's feeling really good about their faith. So gifts-oriented ministry. How do we help each other thrive in our areas where God has gifted us? I mean, that's also love. An empowering leadership style, where the leaders are saying, my job is not only to do this, but it's to help other people do it. Because that ends up, there are a couple of other, need-oriented evangelism, where you're saying, what are the needs of the community, and you're out there doing it. That has an effect. Yes?
So my husband, who is retired, he just volunteered to drive the open table van, and he has told me about how going to different neighborhoods in the city here, and people have come And there's a certain group that will send an elder, and then they're handing out bags of burritos because they don't want, their children aren't coming, but they'll send an adult to come. But I think that's a wonderful example of Zumbro helping people in the community. And I've had coworkers say to me, oh, I've seen this yellow van.
Yeah.
And that's a wonderful thing your church does. And I think that's a great example of helping in the community.
Yes, I think one of the really, when I was listening to it, there's some very exciting things that Zumbro's doing. And they're starting to get a lot of credibility. And they're making a lot of connections. And in a lot of circles, Zumbro is being seen as a church that really cares about the community. It's huge. I'll bet your husband is finding it very rewarding.
Yes, he does.
Yeah, I think that's actually what happened with mission trips. It's almost invariably somebody goes on a mission trip and comes back and they say, I think I got more than I gave, right? And that, I think, actually is what happens all the time when we're empowered to serve in ways that fit us. I would never be called to be a technician to fix technical things like computers. That would not be helpful for anybody else, and it would not be helpful for me. I would just be frustrated, but there are other things I can do. Yeah. Thank you. Other thoughts, because I think it's the church being the church, but sometimes the culture, yeah.
I'm just wondering how you respond to the statement that the congregation, according to the Word of God, is the right form of the kingdom of God on earth.
I would argue that when you look at the kingdom of God, like the 5 things.
That's the first principle of the old Lutheran preacher.
Yeah, the old Lutheran preachers. Yeah. Well, did everybody hear it? Go and say it again.
The congregation, according to the Word of God, is the right form of the kingdom of God on earth.
Well, here's the thing that I think we sometimes forget. I think that the fundamentals of what you do as a congregation, faith, hope, love, are the constants all through history, and when you get away from them, the church does not thrive. I think the challenge is what form and how do you do that in this culture? And I think that ends up being the challenge. And one of the things so I think in time we're going to figure some of this stuff out. We're going to make the changes. But people don't need to be afraid of them, because actually I think when we make the right moves, we're actually going deeper into the heart of what it means to be Christian. And it's not like you have to try to reinvent something that hasn't been there. Does that make sense? I think so. So I'm kind of a deep believer in saying we're having language problems in our society, but we Christians ought to be doing a better job of this on the right and the left, because we got the same scripture. We agree. We should be able to be building bridges in a culture that is building polarities. It seems like there's a tremendous amount of potential that we have in the church for being a leavening agent in the society, instead of being seen, and I don't think it's correct, seen as being irrelevant. I think, and I will have to say that in my years in the church, First Lutheran Church in Duluth, where I was there for 13 years, my 3 best friends, one was really conservative, one's pretty much in the middle, and one is very liberal, and I would call every one of them if my life depended on it, and they'd be there. And I'm thinking to myself, our society is blowing up. Some of the differences here, I'm not even sure I trust it, because I think we have much of the same desires we made, there's a hand over here. No? Oh, yes.
So I would go something with hospitality.
Hospitality.
And I know spoke about many other
Yeah.
subjects, but I think that we have an opportunity
Yeah.
to be hospitable to those that have been
Yeah.
seen as different than our traditional roots. And I speak about it because those who want knowledge, imaginations, who are finding their way without being
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think so. We're a bridge building. I think we're probably at a time here where it's going to be very difficult for me to welcome people. Well, listen, thank you. We will stop right here, but yeah, it's been good to be with you, and it's part of the thinking. But I guess where I finally come down to, I think, is when we become more authentically who we are. That is going to lead us in the right direction. Yeah.